Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and today we are going to analyze all the new cards from the upcoming Gwent Black Sun expansion releasing this Tuesday. I've spent hours reading and strategizing with the new cards, and I have a lot of experience playing unusual archetypes and combos from Gwent seasonal events, so I have a lot of familiarity with what these new cards are looking to do. I was also one of the first to see the Northern Realms cards in preparation for those reveals, so I've had some extra time to think about how best to play them. That means that I'm going to give you more than just some surface level reactions to the cards, but actual in-depth analysis about how good they are and how to play them. I have about 18 pages worth of notes, and we're going to try to do this in one take, so buckle in. Let's start first with monsters, because I think it is probably the most straightforward faction to discuss. The key archetype that the new cards will focus on is Thrive. Units with Thrive get boosted whenever they play a card with higher power. Usually that means that Thrive decks will start with a low power cards at the beginning and playing tons of them, and then building up over time, boosting all of your Thrive engines along the way. By the end of the round, their Thrive units will be quite tall, and at that point, it'll be a little bit difficult to trigger the additional Thrives, because you'll need to play really tall units to do so. Thrive may have been overshadowed recently by Relics, but it still wasn't a bad archetype. In a long round, Thrive decks can still score tons of points, so for Thrive to be the emphasis of the new cards was a little bit surprising, at least to me. An Orchard Mantrap here is a new 3-power, 4-provision cost cursed plant unit that will help support Thrive. If you play it in the melee row, it will consume an allied unit, absorbing the power from that unit, and check to see if it is tall enough to trigger any of your Thrive abilities. What's unique about Orchard Mantrap, though, is that it will then check to see if it can trigger the Thrive again, giving you potentially 2 Thrive triggers in one turn, which is quite rare, if Orchard Mantrap is tall enough to do that at least. If you already have lots of Thrive cards on the board, then that means this card might be able to boost your entire board twice for just 4 provisions. And that's crazy value, because Thrive decks' most expensive cards usually are those point slams that they play at the end of the rounds. So not only this cheaper, freeing up provisions for you to use elsewhere in the deck, but it also can trigger Thrive one additional time. Alternatively, you could use Orchard Mantrap in the range row to infuse 2 cards with Thrive. That means that you would be adding a status to 2 units that would either turn non-Thrive units into Thrive units, which might work in Relic decks, or add more Thrive to existing Thrive units. That would mean that when you play a unit, the double Thrive unit would check once to see if the unit that you played is higher, and if so, you would get boosted once. Then, it would also do the same check a second time, and potentially give you a second boost on the same turn. That would be similar, but slightly different and weaker than the Fuka ability from the existing Fuka card, which only checks Thrive once when you play a unit, and if it gets triggered, then it boosts the Fuka by 2. Most of the time, I think you'd want to play the Mantrap in the melee row as a finisher, but it does give you the flexibility to use it as either an early or late round card, which is really nice. Overall, I think it's a great card for great value. Next up, we have the Cursed Damsel, which is a 4-power, 4-provision cost Thrive unit, and in a Thrive deck, you'd usually be playing 4-power units around the second or third turn, because as we were saying before, you're starting out with your weakest Thrive cards and then building up over time. So think of this as an early to mid-round play. The unique part about the Cursed Damsel, though, is her order ability to cut her power in half and damage an enemy unit by the amount of power that she lost. So that might sound kind of strange. Technically, it is a net 0-point order ability, but because you're dealing damage to your opponent and losing power to your damsel, it's not quite that simple, though. The reason why this is actually useful is because the more you boost your Thrive engines, the more difficult it becomes to trigger those Thrive engines and continue to boost them, since you need a strong unit to trigger that Thrive every turn. That's why this ability helps. Not only can you get decent damage to remove one of your opponent's engines, but by lowering the damsel's power, you can actually make it easier to trigger her Thrive once again, which you otherwise might not have been able to do once she gets high up there, and that means you're turning her back into an engine. Assuming that you use that ability near the end of the round, that order could easily be 3 or 4 damage, and that may not be game-changing damage, but it does give a little more control options to a Thrive archetype that usually ran almost no control at all. So for that reason, the situation in which you use this card and that ability will require a little more practice and skill, but it does fill a bit of a need for Thrive decks. Now, let's move on to the epic card, Scoia'tael, which is a 4-power, 8-provision Cursed Beast. Scoia'tael starts with immunity and 0 points on the deploy ability. The big thing, though, is that when he's on the board, he makes it so that when your opponent plays a unit, those units that your opponent plays can trigger your Thrive cards, just like when you play your own units. In best case scenario, if your opponent is consistently playing tall units, then this could double how often your Thrive engines get triggered, and that would give you way more points. But it could make it hard to plan the best way to trigger your own Thrive units on your turn, because you need to start playing your big point slams even earlier than usual. Then again, Thrive's greatest weakness has always been short rounds in which it doesn't have enough time to boost its Thrive engines, so maybe this could help cover for that weakness. Then again, it's unlikely that you can rely on your opponent to play tall enough units to trigger those Thrive engines for you consistently. That's where Scoia'tael's order ability comes in. Scoia'tael's order will replay him, boosting him by 2 additional points. You can then use that order ability again every turn, continuing to boost him by 2 every time, or 2 more every time. Not only does that turn Scoia'tael into a 2-point per turn engine, but it also gives you another way to trigger Thrive every turn, in addition to either the additional Thrive units or Thrive triggers that you will get from the units that you play from your hand. You will also want to play him fairly early in the round to benefit as soon as possible from your opponent triggering your Thrive units. That means that while Scoia'tael starts relatively small for a unit that triggers Thrive engines at just 4 power, if you're using his order ability every turn, then by the end of the round, his boost will be big enough that he can probably trigger almost any Thrive card. That is probably the difference between Scoia'tael being just a meme and being an important piece of your deck. However, bear in mind that once you've used his order ability at least once, he'll lose that immunity and will likely be something that your opponent is going to target almost immediately. But if they don't, then the high-end potential of Scoia'tael is huge, make no mistake. Then finally, we have the Monster's Legendary card, which is a new 14 provision cost scenario, the Manor's Dark Secret. The scenario progresses to the next chapter whenever you play a Thrive unit, which should be pretty easy to do in a Thrive deck. First, you'll spawn a Cursed Damsel, which, as we said before, is a useful early to mid-round Thrive engine that gives you the option for a little control. It probably still makes the most sense to start the round with your 1, 2, 3, and one of your 4-power Thrive units before you play this, and we'll talk more about why that is later on. Then, play the scenario. At this point in time, you should have a bunch of 4-power Thrive units on the board, because if you start with 1, whenever you play the 2-power Thrive units, they all get boosted up to 2. Once you play the 3-power Thrive units, they all get boosted up to 3. Once you play one of those 4-power Thrive units, they all get boosted up to 4. So, again, just about everything on your board, you're probably looking to have on 4 power at this point in time. So, that includes the Damsel that you spawned in from this scenario. And because normally, when you play a 4-power Thrive unit, you wouldn't trigger any of those 4-power Thrive engines that you have on the board, that's where the first part of the scenario kicks in. In this situation, the scenario will check to see if that unit will trigger any Thrive cards, and realize that, under normal circumstances, if everything on your board is a 4-power Thrive card, and you play a 4-power card, it would not trigger those Thrives. So that's when the scenario gives that 4-power unit a 2-point boost before you play it, which in this case means that now that 4-power unit is up to a 6, and it actually will trigger all those Thrives. Then you play one more Thrive unit, triggering the last chapter, which will let you play the tallest bronze unit from your deck. Normally, you want to make sure that you have at least 1 or 2 tall bronze units to help trigger those Thrives when you get this out, because that's the thing. You want it to be one more way to trigger all those Thrives. But given the extra boost from the scenario, which works as long as the scenario is on the board, even once you move on to Chapter 2, it will give that card a little bit of an extra boost, even if it wouldn't normally be able to trigger that Thrive, which may mean that you don't necessarily need for that to be quite as tall as the absolute biggest of all bronze monsters units, which come in at either 7 or in some cases even 9 power. So ideally, you'd be triggering this as late in the round as possible so that you can maximize the total number of Thrive units on the board when you're getting that extra little point slam. Just make sure that you at least have enough Thrive cards remaining that you can actually still trigger the remaining chapters of the scenario. So overall, I think that Thrive may not have been the top tier before these cards were released, but it was at least half decent, and the new cards look like they would do a nice job of filling in some of Thrive's greatest weaknesses, from providing a little bit of control that it previously lacked, and a quicker way to ramp up your engines, and a more reliable and efficient way to trigger those Thrives at the end of the round as well. With all these additions, I think Thrive could be a very strong and very popular deck archetype for people to play once this expansion gets implemented. Now let's move on to Scoia'tael, and the main archetype that Scoia'tael cards from this expansion will use is Harmony. Units with Harmony will get boosted whenever you play a Scoia'tael unit with a category that you do not yet control. So, for example, if you control several Harmony Dryads, but you don't have any Elves, your Harmony cards will get boosted when you play an Elf. In that situation, the Dryads will get boosted, regardless of whether that Elf has Harmony as well. In some ways, Harmony decks play in a similar way to Monsters Thrive decks. Both start by filling the board with a bunch of weak bronze engines, but look to boost all those engines by 1 every turn so that by the end of the round, they become quite powerful. The primary difference is that Thrive units scale in base power as the cards get stronger, but tend not to have additional abilities, whereas Harmony units don't scale as much in terms of how much base power they have, but usually have additional deploy or order abilities. That means that rather than filling your deck with a wide range of base power on your units, you want to fill your deck with a wide variety of different unit types. It seemed Harmony was often considered to be one of the weakest archetypes in the game before these cards got released, and while it was nowhere near meta, I actually think it was considerably better than people gave it credit for, probably because, well, so few people actually played it enough to realize that it wasn't totally atrocious, despite what many people said about it. Harmony definitely still needed some buffs, but I think these cards could make people realize that Harmony wasn't so bad after all, and now will certainly become significantly stronger. So let's start with what we're seeing here, that of course being the rare card, that Antheron, which is a 5 power, 5 provision beast with Harmony. It has an order ability to infuse a unit with Harmony, which means that it will give one of your other units a status that either turns a non-Harmony unit into a Harmony unit, or makes an existing Harmony unit get boosted twice when you proc Harmony. This card is in a bit of an awkward place because there are already, or at least one, 5 provision cost Bronze Harmony Beast in the game, at least before this upcoming patch. So we'll have to keep an eye out for that. But in a Harmony deck, you don't want to repeat the same type of unit very often because that means you're missing out on potential Harmony procs. So that card is the Trained Hawk, which is 4 less base power, just 3, but it makes up for that by having either a 2 damage ability if you play it in one row, or you can move one of your opponent's units if you play it in the other row. So if you're only going to use one of those cards, which one should you use? Assuming that the Antherian you played early in the round, giving you enough time to get additional boosts from that card that you infuse with Harmony, Antherian is a 5-point unit that will indirectly give you 1 additional point every turn than the Trained Hawk would, making Antherian more valuable. That being said, if existing Harmony units get reworked, such as that Trained Hawk, then it's likely that that will be one that gets buffed and may make that decision a little more difficult. Next, let's jump all the way up to the legendary card. That is Mysteries of Loch Fien, which, like other factions, the legendary card is a doomed scenario, which in this case costs 15 provisions. It progresses to the next chapter every time you play a Harmony unit. It starts by playing Lake Guardian Dawn Aspect, which... The other one? Hold on. Let me pull that up real quick. I may have not gotten it up here, but I suppose I can explain it real quick, because I also have closed Discord. But, which is where I have it. But let's see, where were we? The Dawn Aspect, right? Yeah, that's Dusk. Dawn Aspect will immediately get boosted by the number of unique primary categories you have in your starting deck. Yeah, and basically, I can explain to you what that card does. It's just a 1 base power unit. So it's not really doing anything special other than what you see here, where it's getting its power set to the number of Scoia'tael units with unique primary categories in your starting deck, which, as we were just saying, is something that you are already looking to do for a Harmony deck. So basically, it's just a pure point slam, that means. And with that being said, given that Scoia'tael has Harmony units with 6 distinct primary tags, that means Lake Guardian is probably going to give you at least a 7 power unit when you trigger this first component. However, those are specifically the unique tags on Harmony units in Scoia'tael. There are 6 of those, but if you're going to go as far as to get even more types of Scoia'tael units in your deck, ones that may not have Harmony but can trigger the Harmony on other cards, then you could go as high as 11 unique categories of Scoia'tael units in your starting deck, in which case that would make the Guardian a 12 power unit, which is very impressive tempo, especially for a scenario. That being said, it would require that you include some cards that don't really fit very naturally into the Harmony archetype, such as Torque, which is the only relic card that you could have in your starting deck, and Dwarven Chariot for the machine tag. So for that reason, it's more likely that you'll have that first prologue component come in at 7 to 9 points with all those distinct tags, which is still enough for Mysteries of Lochfiend to be the highest tempo scenario in most situations, at least right off the bat. And once you play your first Harmony unit, whenever you play a Scoia'tael unit, you will boost it by 1 for every category that it has. In most cases, this is just a 1-point boost. As with the Chapter 1 abilities for other scenarios from this expansion, this ability stays active as long as Mysteries of Lochfiend remains on the board, even once you progress to Chapter 2. While this scenario may have the best prologue of all scenarios in the expansion, it has arguably the worst Chapter 2, making the scenario perhaps not quite as good in long rounds, better in short rounds, where you're getting the big benefit from that tempo point slam at the beginning. But either that, or you could potentially play it at the closer to the end of the round rather than the beginning of the round, which is generally where you're going to be playing other scenarios. But however, when you trigger the last chapter of the scenario, you will spawn and play Lochfiend Convergence, creating a bronze Scoia'tael unit that you don't control. Once again, this is similar to the Monsters Thrive equivalent from the Dark Manor's Secret, the last chapter of that. Both give you a way at or near the end of the round to boost all of your engines. So that's another reason why, technically speaking, you might want to play Mysteries of Lochfiend middle / near the end of the round when you already have a bunch of Harmony units on the board, so that when you actually do go and trigger this last chapter, you're maximizing the point slam that you're getting. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Though in this case, for Lochfiend, it's just about, or the difference is at least, is that in this case, it's about getting a guaranteed boost where you know for certain that this is going to trigger your Harmonies, whereas in the case of the Monsters' final play in the last chapter of their scenario, it's not quite a guaranteed boost because you don't necessarily know if that bronze card you're getting from your deck is going to be high enough to trigger those Thrive engines on your board. But then again, the lower base power that you're likely to get on this Scoia'tael unit maybe makes them roughly equivalent for that last chapter. So overall, the scenario provides fantastic tempo, probably the best prologue, as we were saying, even in a short round, something that would normally be a weakness of both Harmony and scenarios in general. That might make this the strongest scenario in this expansion, especially because when combined with Denna, the Call of Harmony leader ability, you can trigger both chapters of the scenario just one turn after playing it, which might be absolutely broken. Speaking of tempo, let's actually hop back over to the epic Scoia'tael card from this expansion, and that is Lake Guardian Dusk Aspect. And it's a Harmony card that gets boosted while it's on the board, as with most Harmony engines, but also while in your hand and in your deck. And that makes it a perfect Harmony finisher, especially in round 3, because it gains power throughout the entirety of the game, even before you play it. The one downside to that is that because it's a beast, which is a pretty common category in Scoia'tael, it's pretty unlikely that if you are using it as a point slam at the end of the round, that it's actually going to trigger Harmonies. So If it is the last card that you play, you're probably already going to have that beast on the board, and Lake Guardian Dust Aspect doesn't trigger the harmonies, but you're making up for that with the high base power. That being said, this could still be an amazing card because, once again, it covers for one of Harmony's greatest weaknesses, which is its lack of tempo. Then finally, last but certainly not least, we'll go to what is actually the Scoia'tael common card, the Chameleon, but there's a reason why I say this for last. The Chameleon is a 4-power, 4-provision beast that will give itself a category that you don't yet control when you play it, which means that it guarantees that you will trigger Harmony when you play it. That makes Chameleon the perfect finisher near the end of the round, when you have lots of Harmony units on the board, but not many options remaining to trigger those Harmony boosts. That ability by itself would make it strong, but it's even better. With Chameleon's Order ability, you can replay it, which will cause it to trigger Harmony at the, will cause it to lose its previous category, and regain a new one, once again, triggering all of those Harmonies at the end of the round. So that means you're probably playing it on your second to last turn, and then on your last turn, use that Order ability to replay it. The Chameleon will lower its base power by 1 whenever you do this, which means that you can play a single Chameleon, I think, for a total of 4 times before it will destroy itself. I'm not 100% sure if you can continue to replay it every turn until it gets down to 0 base power, but if so, then you could play it even earlier and get even more Harmony point slams out of it, just making it incredible. Absolutely incredible. So, and not to mention, if you do actually choose to use that Order ability when you have it on 1 power and reduce its base power to 0, destroying it, you technically could actually then, if you have a super crowded board, now use that board space that you created to play something else and maybe trigger those Harmonies once again, because Harmony does tend to have a very crowded board. So once again, it's very similar to the corresponding monsters card, Orchard Mantrap, except that in this case, you can, it boosts, if it does allow you to play it that many times, up to 4 times your entire board, rather than the 2 times you might get from the Mantrap. Assuming that you load the board with Harmony units, then the point potential for the Chameleon is absolutely ridiculous for a 4 provision cost card, which is part of what makes me think that maybe you can only replay it with that Order ability once. But I mean, if you're playing against Scoia'tael, destroy this thing as soon as you see it. So overall, I think that Harmony was better than people were giving it credit for, and Scoia'tael may have gotten the strongest cards from this expansion. So for that reason, I think Harmony will be in a very strong place in this meta. Next, let's move on to Skellige, which, for the archetype that's going to be the primary focus of this one, if you can call it that, it's going to be cards that focus on Cataclysm and, more generally, damage. Cataclysm is a row effect that deals 3 damage split randomly across all units in one of your opponent's rows at the start of their turn. There were a few existing cards that could apply Cataclysm, such as Matic, but they were all neutral cards, so for that reason, there aren't really any existing Cataclysm synergies for Skellige outside of the more general synergies that Skellige has with damage and Bloodthirst. But first we have the Seagull, which is a 1-power, 4-provision cost, common cursed beast pirate. On deploy, it damages 3 units by 1, making it a 4-point for 4-provision card, which, to put it bluntly, is bad. However, each target that is damaged, Seagull will spawn a copy of itself in your graveyard. Now the wording here is important. To trigger the extra ability, the units that you target have to be damaged, meaning that they need to be below their base power. That means that if you use Seagull to hit a boosted unit, it will not create an additional Seagull in your graveyard. On the other hand, Seagull could target a unit that is already damaged, and as long as it doesn't destroy that unit, it will create a copy of itself in your graveyard, even if that damaged unit doesn't take damage from Seagull. Like, for example, if it has, it's already damaged, but it has armor or a shield, so the 1 damage from Seagull doesn't actually do anything to it. Still works in that situation. Then once you destroy a unit, all of the Seagulls in your graveyard will get summoned from your graveyard to the range row. Now, with all of Skellige's damage, that should be quite easy to do. The bigger question is, how useful is that? If the Seagull damaged 3 units by 1, then that's 4 points of value. If you created 3 Seagulls in your graveyard and you summon them out when you destroy an enemy, then that's 7 points of value, which is around what you would expect from a 4 provision cost card. That being said, that might be the weirdest 7 points for 4 provision cost card that we have ever seen in the game. So it is quite odd. But there are two useful ways I can think of to use the Seagull. One of them is that in a deck with a lot of self-damage, you could use Sarah's Fearless, who heals one of your units and then damages one of your units by the same amount. In this case, if you have lots of highly damaged units, like Melusine or some of the cultists, then you could potentially heal one of them with Saris for more than 1 point of healing, and then over-damage the Seagulls as a sacrifice, because no matter how much you're healing that other unit, you're only gonna get 1 damage to yourself on that Seagull. So, other helpful ways you could use the Seagull could be that you could potentially use them as a form of carryover by waiting to summon them from your graveyard until a later round. That would mean that the Seagull is only playing for 4 points in a round in which you play it, which is a little painful, but that initial Seagull, along with the others that you created, would all come out of your graveyard to give you 4 points of carryover when you destroy one of your opponent's units in the next round. You could even use Freya's Blessing to play some of those Seagulls from your graveyard and multiply your Seagulls like crazy, which is probably purely a meme, but I am kind of curious to see if anyone tries that out, because it would be quite cool to see. But overall, on the low end, it is pretty clearly the worst card in this expansion, but on the high end, there are some really creative things that you can do with it that could still make it valuable. Next, let's move on, because we have the rare Skellige card, which is the Deranged Corsair. It's a 4-power, 5 provision cost, cursed human pirate that will spawn Cataclysm on a row and makes it so that when you destroy a specific enemy unit on that row, it will spawn 2 more turns of Cataclysm. Theoretically, because each turn of Cataclysm is 3 points of damage, that's a total of 13 points for 5 provisions, which would be fantastic value. Skellige even has some cards like the Ancrate Greatsword and Dagger 2 Blades that either get healed or boosted when you deal damage, which could mean that this card sets you up for even more points. However, not everything is great about this card. First off, it's only possible for Cataclysm to deal 3 damage per turn, regardless of how much Cataclysm you have put on a row. Sure, 3 points of damage per turn from a bronze card is still fantastic, but it does mean that the more Cataclysm you apply, the less likely you are to actually have enough time to benefit from that damage. Take that from someone who has played seasonal events with 6 or more Maddox having 12 plus turns of Cataclysm that will never trigger. It's painful. That is a similar issue to what other weather effects like rain used to experience, which, before a bunch of rain-specific cards were introduced about a year ago, was an archetype that was very unreliable and very rarely, if ever, saw play. Similarly to rain, Cataclysm splits damage randomly across all units in the row, so if there is a specific unit that you want to destroy, whether or not you destroy that important unit could come down to luck. Cataclysm deals 3 damage per turn, whereas Rain only deals 2, and Cataclysm can hit the same enemy unit multiple times, whereas Rain cannot, so that is one reason why the Deranged Corsair should still be a little better than the various Rain cards were before they got all those supporting cards like Fulmar, Melusine, Cultist, and Messenger of the Sea. However, on the downside, the Deranged Corsair does not have the same synergistic cards that Rain has. It does not have the engines that get boosted from Rain like Melusine Cultist and Messenger of the Sea, but maybe the superior damage kinda makes up for that. However, unlike Rain and Storm, you cannot trigger all of your remaining turns of Rain at the end of the round by playing Ryogan from your graveyard, which is what makes stacking many turns of Cataclysm have potentially huge diminishing returns. If you're getting more turns of Cataclysm and you can never trigger them, then it's quite literally 0 additional value. Then again, this is a 5 provision bronze unit, not a huge epic or legendary, so maybe you just live with those downsides, because overall, it's a card that will play similarly to Rain cards, but have more damage with less boosts and potentially less late round value if you don't have time to trigger all that Cataclysm. That, and because by using Cataclysm, you will overwrite any other weather effects that you have on that row, you'll likely want to choose whether you want to play Cataclysm or Rain/Storm, but not mix those cards in the same deck. Technically, you could put Cataclysm in one row and Rain/Storm in the other, but I anticipate that if you try to do that, you're gonna find things get pretty awkward pretty quickly. Next, we have the epic Skellige card, which is Bjorn Stormerson. First of all, amazing name, which is a 5 power, 8 provision cost cursed human pirate with 2 armor. He has veteran, so his base power goes up by 1 every round. He also has a unique deploy ability, Clash, which means that when you play him, he and the enemy unit that you target will immediately damage each other by their power. Similar to what Ernachad does with his adrenaline ability, just that in this case, you're targeting a unit that's already on the board. That comparison is also helpful because you can set up Bjorn in similar ways to how you would set up Ernachad, by giving him extra armor and or by making it so that he can't take damage. Because Bjorn is a pirate, if you're using the Onslaught Leader ability, you could do the first option, whenever you damage an enemy unit while Bjorn is in your hand. The second option you can do if you play Bjorn to the left of Sucrus, just like you would Ernachad. Assuming that Bjorn survives this clash, and if your opponent has 2 or more damaged units, you can then discard a card from your hand and put Bjorn back into your hand. Assuming that you're discarding one of your weaker cards and trading that for another opportunity to use Bjorn's deploy ability, this could be a useful way to remove more of your opponent's units. Combine that with having iced on the board when you do that discarding, and you could summon the card that you discarded back onto the board for even more value. Overall, Bjorn looks like a difficult card to master, but once you do, he will have lots of creative and powerful uses. Then lastly, we have the Skellige legendary scenario, Endless Voyage, which is a 14 provision cost scenario that progresses whenever you play a pirate. When you play it, you'll spawn Bjorn's Drakkar, which is a 5 power unit that, if I'm understanding its order correctly, damages one of your opponent's units by 1, and then makes it so that whenever that unit receives damage, it gets damaged by that amount an additional time. So basically, it's a huge debuff that makes it much easier for you to destroy one of your opponent's biggest units by doubling the damage to it, I think. I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding that properly, though. Once you play your first pirate, going back to the scenario, that is, once you play your first pirate, every time your opponent plays a unit, it will gain a status that will cause it to spawn a turn of Cataclysm on that row when you destroy the unit. Once again, as I said with the Deranged Corsair, a little Cataclysm is great for damage, but because you can't make it trigger faster than 3 damage per turn or use any remaining turns of Cataclysm at the end of the round, it does have downsides relative to Rain and Storm. Unless Ryogan gets patched to also trigger Cataclysm, and if that happens, then, oh my goodness. I'm hoping that doesn't happen, because it would be unbelievably strong. So once you play your second pirate, though, you either heal Bjorn's Drakkar, increasing its base power by 5, and give it another charge to debuff another enemy, or if your original Drakkar got destroyed, you'll spawn in a new one. Overall, I'm not a huge fan of this scenario because assuming that you have a Deranged Corsair or 2 in your deck, there's only so many turns of Cataclysm that you can actually benefit from, and if you do get stuck with your scenario and both Corsairs in your hand in the same round, then those Corsairs could be playing for 4 rather than 13. The debuff that the Drakkar gives helps to make up for the random spread of damage from the Cataclysm by helping you focus your damage on 1 or 2 high priority targets, which could work especially well with Bjorn, but this scenario still feels a little awkward to play, at least to me. So overall, Skellige gets access to another powerful form of wide damage with Cataclysm, though I still have some questions about how well the cards will fit in with other Skellige units, or if people who are interested in Cataclysm decks revert back to Rain after a brief period of trying it out. As a big fan of Sucrus plus Ernachad, I'm most excited about adding Bjorn to those decks to destroy both units that my opponent has already played and the ones that my opponent is going to play with a combination of Ernachad and Bjorn. But now let's move on to Syndicate, because as for Syndicate, the new cards, there they are, will give us lots of new coin generators, which could work in any Syndicate deck, but theoretically, they may be most well suited in Hoard decks. Hoard abilities trigger at the end of your turn when you have at least a certain number of coins. That means that rather than spending your coins as soon as you get them, you have reasons to, well, hoard them. The Hoard archetype is most effective using the Hidden Cache Leader ability because, in addition to giving coins, it lowers the number that every Hoard ability needs to reach by 2, so that's likely where there will be the most synergies with the new cards. And let's start simple with a common card. Pearl Diver is a 4-power, 4-provision human Tidecloak pirate. After 3 turns, she will give you 6 coins. That means that if she gets locked or destroyed quickly, then you won't get great value from her. But if she does stay long enough, then 6 coins is a huge amount, especially for just 4 provisions. Oftentimes, people calculate the value from coin earners as 1 coin equals 1 point, which would make the Pearl Diver a slow 10 points for 4 provisions. Yes, that takes 3 turns, but 10 per 4 is still more value than many 5 provision cost cards. Furthermore, many Syndicate cards these days can get more than 1 point per coin, in which case Pearl Diver is worth even more than 10 points, which would be fantastic. Compare that to something like the Tax Collector, which is another 4-power, 4-provision coin generator that is common in many Syndicate decks. In 3 turns, Pearl Diver generates 6 coins, but Tax Collector would only generate 3. The only way Tax Collector would outperform Pearl Diver would be if your opponent locks or destroys whatever coin generator you would be using before the Pearl Diver gives you that profit, in which case Tax Collector might out-earn the Pearl Diver by 1 or 2 coins. The other way would be if you play Tax Collector early in the round, and the round goes for more than 6 turns, and he doesn't get answered, and at that point he will eventually out-earn the Pearl Diver. However, that means Pearl Diver is a higher risk, higher reward version of one of the best Bronze Syndicate cards, which I think makes it a pretty solid choice in many decks. Now moving on to Syndicate's rare card, we have the Treasure Huntress, which is a 4-power, 5-provision human Tidecloak pirate. She will give you 3 coins when you play her, and if you have more than 7 coins, you can spend 3 coins to give an allied unit a status that makes it generate 1 coin per turn. On the surface, this ability is pretty simple. You think the round is going to last more than 3 turns, it's probably worth using that ability. If you think it will end sooner than that, then it isn't. However, because you can only use that ability once you reach 7 coins, which is a pretty high amount, then you may not always be able to make that work, because that's less time in which to use that. But if you're using Hidden Cash to reduce the Hoard number down to 5, then that could make Treasure Huntress much easier to use. But if you do think that you'll have enough time to generate coins for this ability, surely there are still quicker and more efficient ways to do so, right? Well, quicker, definitely. But this ability is actually about the frequency of coin generation, not so much the quantity. If, for example, you infuse the coin generation on 2 units, and you have Townsfolk in your deck, which get boosted by 1 every time you gain coins, then gaining a coin from 2 separate sources automatically every turn can help get more boosts on the Townsfolk than you would from a 2-profit ability. I do think we'll see more Townsfolk after this patch, but that's still a relatively niche situation. More likely, if you have so many coins that you can afford to use the infuse ability numerous times, then you may be able to automatically regain most of the coins that you spend each turn, allowing you to spend extra aggressively. That would make Treasure Huntress a fairly greedy card that only works well when you're already doing very well, but would not be very useful when a round is not going very well for you. For that reason, unless I'm missing some big synergy, I don't expect for Treasure Hunter to be used very often, except for one specific case, which we'll discuss now, because that is when you play the Syndicate Epic card, Flinders Crew. Flinders Crew is a 3-power, 8-provision human Tidecloak pirate. The key ability that this card is that like the Hidden Cash leader ability, it reduces the number of coins that it takes to trigger Hoard abilities. Though, in this case, just by 1 rather than the 2 that you get from the leader ability. Except that, because it spawns 3 additional copies of itself when you play it, that means that collectively, they will reduce the Hoard threshold for your cards by 4. Combine that with Hidden Cash, and any abilities that start at Hoard 6 or lower will automatically trigger even without any coins. It also means that the most difficult Hoards to trigger, Hoard 9, would get bumped all the way down to just Hoard 3, making them very easy to trigger. This is where the synergy comes in for Treasure Huntress. If you have all the Flinders Crew on the board while playing Hidden Cash, then if you have 3 coins to use her fee ability, that means that, by definition, you already exceed the coin threshold. That means that you can use that ability much earlier, which would make it more valuable, and you may be able to use it multiple times in one turn to set up numerous coin-earning engines simultaneously, which would be very difficult to do without Flinders Crew or Hidden Cash, because by using the fee, you might drop back below that Hoard threshold. However, it's not that simple. In fact, if you've never reached 9 coins before in the match, or 7 coins in the case of Hidden Cache, then Flinder's Crew will not spawn any additional copies of itself. That's what its counter ability is all about. Basically, it means that for every round that you've reached its hoard threshold, it will spawn in 1 more copy of itself when you play it. That means that if you play it immediately in round 1, it would be quite weak. However, if you earned lots of coins in round 1, 2, and 3, then it will spawn in all its copies, making it incredibly powerful. Notably, that means that to reach maximum value, you would need to play long enough in all 3 rounds to reach that hoard threshold, so that may encourage players to push fairly hard in round 2, and otherwise, that would mean that if they don't do that, they're going to miss out on one of those copies when they play Flinder's Crew, even if they wait to play it in round 3. Even if you do reach 9 coins in round 2, though, that probably would mean that round 2 went long enough that round 3 will become relatively short, and with Flinder's Crew, you want the round in which you play it to be as long as possible to maximize the benefit of lowering all of your hoard abilities. That is probably the only thing balancing this card out and preventing it from becoming borderline unstoppable. Because either you play long enough in round 2 to reach the card's coin threshold, powering it up for round 3, or you skip reaching that hoard threshold in round 2 to keep round 3 long, but you sacrifice a copy of Flinder's Crew in round 3 to do so. Either way, I think this card will be very popular and may single-handedly inspire lots of people to play Hidden Cache. Then let's move on, lastly, to Syndicate's legendary card, which is In Search of Forgotten Treasure. Let's call it Treasure for short. Treasure is a 15 provision cost curse scenario that progresses whenever you play a Tidecloak. At the beginning, it spawns Gudrun Bjornsdatter, which is a 4-power cursed human that's Tidecloak. At the beginning, or I should say, if you have at least 7 coins, it gives you the option to spend 3 coins to give an opposing unit a status that deals 1 damage to them every time you earn a coin. So of course, with Hidden Cache and or Flinder's Crew, you can potentially lower that hoard number all the way down to just 1, at which point it's possible to use it multiple times in the same turn. And this is your big coin spender, and an interesting one at that. Pacing-wise, it's not great, because you will need to earn coins at least 3 separate times for it to pay off. However, when properly set up, this can potentially wipe your opponent's entire board in 1 turn. Remember when we talked about how Treasure Huntress would give you lots of individual sources of coin generation? Yeah, Gudrun is probably the primary reason why that is useful. If you have infused 4 of those cards to give you coin generation at the end of your turn, then Gudrun's Infuse could potentially destroy multiple of your opponent's cards at the end of your turn every single turn. I'm thinking that if you're using Hidden Cache, then you use the leader ability at the start of the round, then play a crime card to get yourself up to at least 7 coins, and then play your scenario and Flinder's Crew to set up your hoard cards. Start using Gudrun's Infuse ability, and then play non-stop coin generators, including the Treasure Huntress, to turn everyone into a coin generator, and you can both spend and earn 9 coins every turn, dealing 9 damage to every unit that Gudrun has marked, and that's just the prologue, which is ridiculous. So going back to the scenario itself, once you play your first Tidecloak, you will finish your turn, or if you finish your turn with 8 coins, you will automatically get your coin count filled back up to the maximum of 9, which basically means 1 free coin per turn. This is where using Hidden Cache really pays off, though, because now if you do that, you can finish your turn with just 6 coins and automatically get boosted back up to 9 coins, which gives you, in this case, 3 free coins per turn. And in Flinder's Crew's case, as long as you have a few coin generators, you're almost guaranteed to get back up to 9 coins after every turn, regardless of how many coins you spent. Remember that this effect remains active as long as your scenario remains on the board, even once you move on to Chapter 2. Then when you play your second Tidecloak, you will damage the highest enemy unit by the number of coins that you have. As we said before, as you will regain most, if not all, of the coins that you spend every turn, that could fairly easily be around 8 to 9 points of damage. That means that you can use Gudrun to target the lower powered units, and then use Scenario Chapter 2 to destroy whatever bigger units your opponent might have. With all those abilities, when set up properly, this scenario has incredible damage and coin generation potential. Overall, the new Syndicate cards have a lot in common. They can play for huge value, but it takes a long time to set them up. That makes them vulnerable if they get disrupted early, and makes them far stronger in a long round than in a short round. However, in some cases, in order to maximize the value of some individual cards, it is necessary to play in round 2, reducing the length of round 3, and making it harder to benefit as much from all of those engines. With all of that, it may take some more practice and skill to play the new Syndicate cards than it would to play new cards from other factions, but if you can pull it off, it could definitely be worth it. Now let's move on to Northern Realms. And for Northern Realms, the new cards will focus on Knight synergies. Unlike most other factions that are getting new cards that will build upon existing archetypes, there isn't really a cohesive strategy for playing Northern Realms Knights together in the same deck. Unless we're counting Shield Wall and the Duelist Knights, Selkirk and Onsays, but that's just 2 cards, so that's a bit of a stretch. For that reason, it's harder to contextualize and evaluate how good the new cards will be, because for the most part, they're building a new archetype from scratch. That already has seemed to lead some people to underrate the new Northern Realms cards, but as someone who spent 50 plus hours looking at these cards when making one of the NR reveals, I will tell you why. These cards may be a lot more valuable than people are giving them credit for. First, we have the Squire, as we see here, which is a 4-power, 4-provision human knight. Its order ability will boost the next unit that you play by 2, and if it's a knight, then the card will also gain the status that will boost it by 1 every turn. That means that at a minimum, Squire is playing for 6 points at 4 provisions, which is about average for most cards, but would be weak relative to the other common cards in this expansion. However, if you use that order on a knight, then it's playing as 7 or 6 at a minimum, but also creates a new 1 point per turn engine, so the earlier you set that up, the more valuable it will be. That's similar to a Temerian Drummer, which is a 4-power, 5-provision unit, though in that case, the Drummer activates immediately rather than needing a turn to use its order, and can boost any unit by 1 per turn, not just knights, so that's why the Drummer costs 1 more provision. That makes the Squire a little different from the other common cards in this expansion, because most of them are finishers, whereas the Squire is very clearly an early round engine creator. Nonetheless, it is still a solid addition that synergizes well with other Northern Realms cards that benefit from receiving boosts. Speaking of cards that benefit from receiving boosts, let's move on to the next card, because that is definitely the case for the new Northern Realms rare card, Knight Errant. It is a 3-power, 5-provision human knight that gets boosted by 1 at the end of your turn for each adjacent boosted unit, and damaged by 1 at the end of your turn for each damaged adjacent unit. This card fits right in with the classic Northern Realms units. Before Northern Realms was all about mages and siege engines, or at least the buffs that turned those into NR decks that were all about the damage. Before that, NR was, it was a little bit different. It was, its primary focus was on boosting as many units as possible and receiving additional benefits when you use those boosts. And that's exactly how Errant Knight, or Knight Errant, will reward you. If you have been spreading those boosts around, then it's a 2-point per turn engine, which at 5 provisions is solid value. Because it's a potential 2-point per turn engine that takes a little bit of setup to enable, reminds me a little bit of some of the the cards that feel almost like they were stolen from Northern Realms, at least the way in which they function. Similar to, for example, Monster's Witch Apprentice, which I heard may have just gotten buffed, which, if that is the case, is already a strong card. That's ridiculous. But that's an aside. In this case, Monsters would have needed 25 points in a row before that Witch Apprentice would get boosted by 2, which is probably a little harder to do than getting 2 adjacent units boosted for the Knight Errant, but that's why the Witch Apprentice starts out with 1 more base power and doesn't have the downside that the Knight Errant has when it gets next to damaged units. That's not all, though, because once the Knight Errant reaches 9 power, it triggers its Grace ability, which is a new type of ability. Basically just means that once it reaches that number, it triggers an extra effect. So once it does that, it will give adjacent units shields, and those units will also get boosted by 2 whenever they lose those shields. The Knight Errant can only trigger this ability once, that is the case for all Grace abilities, when it reaches that 9 power for the first time. Without additional context, that ability may seem rather odd. I mean, we were just talking about maximizing boosts. What does NR care about shields, right? Well, there are two types of decks that absolutely love this ability. The first are Shield Wall Ragnar decks. When you play Ragnar, he removes all shields on the board and then gets boosted by 3 for each shield removed. In this case, not only could you create more shields for Ragnar to destroy, but you would also boost those units that have the shields by 2 when Ragnar removes them, for an additional 4 points of value. That makes one of the biggest finishers in the game even bigger, though Ragnar decks tend to already play units that have shields, so you may not have too many good targets to get those shields and boosts too. And Ragnar decks tend not to have much boosting outside of Ragnar himself, so it could be a little difficult to get the Knight Errant up to 9 power to begin with. The real synergy that I'm looking for with Knight Errant, though, is with Onsace and Selkirk, my preferred Shield Wall units. These are the only units in the game with dueling abilities, which are incredibly powerful, but I think that people may have kind of forgotten about them. When you use Onsace or Selkirk's dueling ability, they will start by damaging one of your opponent's units by however much power they have. Then, once the opposing unit has been damaged, if it's still alive, it hits Onsace or Selkirk back by however much power it has. They then go back and forth, trading hits until one of them gets destroyed. These abilities are powerful because the card that starts the duel hits first, so even if it doesn't immediately destroy its target, that unit is going to be much weaker when it hits back, which means that Selkirk and Onsace can actually destroy cards that have much higher power than they have. These cards tend to be run in Shield Wall decks because that means that you can get them one full power hit on the target with the initial hit. Target hits back, but when that target hits back, it does. Selkirk and Onsace don't take any damage because the shield will mitigate that damage, and then that means they can turn right around and hit the targeted unit once again for full damage, and enough to either destroy a tall unit or significantly weaken it so that by the time it hits back on Onsace or Selkirk again, at that point, it's dealing very little damage, and again, they'll continue to trade hits, but at that point, it's much more likely that Selkirk and Onsace are actually able to finish that unit off. So for context, just to give you a better sense as to how those numbers actually add up, a 5-power duelist with a shield can take down a 10-power unit without taking any damage, or destroy a 12-power unit without taking damage, or rather, destroy a 12-power unit and take 2 damage in the process. That's with a shield and with no boosts. However, because Knight Errant not only can give shields, but it also gets those units boosted when they lose their shields, and that could be something that happens for these duelists, then that means that a 5-power duelist can destroy a 12-power unit without taking any damage, or a 14-power unit after taking 2 damage itself. That is without applying any additional boosts to the duelist, from anything other than at least that Knight Errant shield and boost when the shield gets removed. So that's pretty crazy, because that means that when you use something like Shield Wall to give it additional points, then or really, I should say more so, any boost that you put on a duelist unit when it has a shield, because of the value that it gets from the base power and the value that it gets from having more damage the multiple times that it can hit enemies with that dual ability, one boost on a duelist unit could easily turn into 3 points of value, and that can scale exponentially. So that is pretty amazing. So that's why it's not only the Knight Errant that is much stronger that you thought it was, but also, because it synergizes so well with Onsace and with Selkirk, then I think we're going to see a lot more Onsaces and Selkirks in this upcoming patch as well. That, and if you use Amphibious Assault to play Knight Errant, then it immediately gets boosted up to a 7, which, at that point, if you play it in the middle of 2 boosted units, it will trigger its Grace ability at the end of your turn, and that means that you can have, even pacing-wise, that Grace trigger almost immediately, which is fantastic. Next, we have the Northern Realms Epic, the Maiden Shield, which is a 4-power, 9-provision human knight that starts with a shield and has 2 Grace abilities. When the Maiden Shield gets boosted to an 8 or higher for the first time, it spawns in Bronwyn the Bold to the right. So let's take a look at Bronwyn. So, for Bronwyn, She is a 2-power unit that has immunity, so that means neither you nor your opponent can target her directly. However, because Northern Realms units has cards that can trigger adjacent units, or can boost adjacent units automatically without needing to manually target them, it is still possible to boost Bronwyn fairly easily, even if you can't actually target her. So, when she reaches 5 power, she gains an order ability that lets her give one of your other units a status that whenever that unit gets boosted, it then gets boosted again by the same amount. That means that if you apply that status to a card that gets additional value from receiving boosts, like one of those Duelist Knights, Archgriffin, Cohen, Nathaniel Pastodi, Trident Infantry, or one of your Grace Knights, then you will double the number of boosts that that card receives. As we said before, one boost on a shielded Duelist Knight not only increases its base power, but also gives it at least 2 more points of damage, possibly more, for a total of 3 points of value per boost, if not more. So doubling those boosts could make one boost worth 6 points, which could quickly make Selkirk or Anses able to destroy just about any unit that your opponent has, no matter how tall it is. Then again, if your opponent doesn't have one super tall unit to duel, then that's probably overkill, so in that case, you might want to more so use Bronwyn's ability on Trident Infantry to spread that damage across multiple of your opponent's units, or Archgriffin for huge carryover. But back to the Maiden's Shield, because when it gets boosted to 14 for the first time, it boosts Bronwyn by 3, which gives you more or less just a guaranteed way to reach her Grace threshold, even if you aren't targeting her with other boosts with things like, say, a Temerian Drummer. If the Maiden's Shield gets destroyed, then it will lock Bronwyn. Once Bronwyn has used her ability, though, it's no big deal, because you just need to make sure that you have enough time to get that order ability on Bronwyn used, and at that point, once she's already done that, she's not really providing any additional value other than being a unit that has immunity that's hard to target. So for that reason, shouldn't be a huge risk. So not too much of a concern there, I don't think. So that being said, assuming you can get Bronwyn boosted enough to use her order ability early enough in the round, it makes it possible to boost a unit to the moon, which for Northern Realms can come with a huge host of additional benefits. I think the hardest part is that you will want to do that as quickly as possible to maximize the benefit of that infuse ability, but with all the other cards that you're going to want to boost for Northern Realms, will you have enough boost to make that happen? Well, if so, it could absolutely pay off. Then lastly, for Northern Realms, we have Damsel in Distress, a 14 provision cost curse scenario that progresses when you play a knight. When you play it, it summons a Brawn Knight from your deck to the same row. Once you play that first knight, every time you trigger a Grace ability, you will boost adjacent units by 2. That ability stays active for as long as Damsel in Distress is on the board, even after moving on to Chapter 2. When you play your second knight, you will play Mad Charge, which will boost an allied unit by 5, give it 2 armor, and 2 vitality if you control a knight. That's recently been reworked in the upcoming patch, to make it more of a boost, a little less of vitality. But since you played a knight to trigger that last chapter, you're almost certain that you're going to get that vitality. This is the card that I revealed and analyzed a few days ago, and I poured over 50 hours into analyzing that card and editing that video, including what cards to combine with it, and when, so check that video out for the basics. What I couldn't discuss in that video, though, was how specifically Damsel in Distress could combine with the other new cards and how it compares to the other scenarios. Let's first of all just acknowledge that I heard a lot of people saying that they were underwhelmed by the card, at least in comparison to the other scenarios. And I think there are some reasons for that, some of which are well justified for sure, but others that may be some misconceptions that you can fall for at first glance. Firstly, there's the total number of points that this card gives, which, to put it bluntly, when compared to the other scenarios, is probably the lowest. Assuming that in the prologue you summon a Redanian Knight that has some time to get boosted, or a Kedwani Knight that immediately gets boosted up to a 7, let's call that 7 points. That's at least 2 points less than the Scoia'tael and Monsters prologue, potentially slightly better pacing but worse long-term value than the Skellige and Syndicate prologue, and potentially only better than the Nilfgaard prologue that we'll discuss in a minute. Chapter 1 ability, that looks weak because although it can be 4 or even 8 points per turn, depending on how often you trigger Grace abilities, because you can only trigger a unit's Grace ability once, and the maximum number of Grace units you have in your starting deck is 3, or 4 if we include Bronwyn, then that's a pretty hard limit in terms of how much value you can get from Chapter 1. Finally, Chapter 2 gives you a card that almost no one ever uses. However, that may all sound bad, from a total point standpoint, and it may be to a certain extent. But before you dismiss this card as complete and utter trash, let me tell you why it's not as bad as it seems, and in the right hands, could still be a solid addition to Northern Realms decks. First, although the prologue may be worth less points than the other prologues, it provides unique value in two ways. It is the only prologue that gives us flexibility to choose the card that we get, and thins a card from our deck. It's hard to put an exact number value on that because it doesn't directly translate to points, but those are the kinds of subtle differences that separate the good decks from the great decks, and the good players from the great players. Now let's remind ourselves that, as we discussed previously, like coin generation for Syndicate, one boost for Northern Realms can often be worth more than just 1 point. So that's also definitely a relevant factor as well, once we consider the other abilities that Northern Realms has for boosted units. Mad Charge on a 5-power Onsace or Selkirk immediately gets them up to 10 points with 2 armor, which, especially if you can get a Knight Errant or a Shield Wall Charge to give them a shield, means that they can destroy almost any of your opponent's units, giving you far more than the 5 points of value that you would see directly coming from that special card. And if Selkirk or Onsace are getting boosted by the Chapter 1 ability, then that removal is even faster and easier. So, if you go that route, then you'll probably want to save Damsel in Distress to destroy whatever big cards your opponent was waiting to play in round 3. Alternatively, you could play Damsel in Distress in round 1, use Archgriffin as your boost target, and gain huge carryover for round 2 and round 3, giving you the limited number of Grace units, or giving you the, in that case, I should say, giving you strong win conditions in basically every round. Scenario round 1, and then the carryover on the Archgriffin in round 2 and round 3. And that's something that very few, if any, of the other scenarios can do. So then there's the limited number of Grace cards that cap the total amount of value you can get from Chapter 1. For this, let's recall that unlike almost every other scenario that we've seen thus far, Damsel in Distress isn't really buffing an existing archetype as much as it's creating a new archetype that didn't really exist in the first place. And the patch notes also just dropped, and to summarize, there are now way more units that have Grace. Old ones have been reworked to add Grace, so there should now be plenty of ways to benefit from Chapter 1. And with all that being said, there are new Northern Realms cards. Are the new Northern Realms cards weaker than the other new cards from other factions? Well, maybe a little, but probably not as much as would first appear because of the additional value that Northern Realms gets from those boosts, and because there is some value in the flexibility and thinning that only Northern Realms is gaining. Are the Northern Realms cards more difficult to play than the other cards from the other factions? To a certain extent, maybe. At least a little bit more than Monsters and Scoia'tael. However, given how much I think Northern Realms will get, the most significant changes from the upcoming patch, which I've only had a brief moment to skim, I think that with all those things subject to change, it's why we're almost certainly going to, I think thus far at least, we've almost certainly been too quick to judge these new additions for Northern Realms, and once we get to dive in a little bit deeper into those patch changes, we'll see that Northern Realms, I think, will still, at the end of the day, be in a solid place. Then for our last faction, we have Nilfgaard, which, let's first acknowledge this. With its unique ability to create lots of cards from its opponent's deck and boost assimilate engines in the process, in some ways, a buff to any other faction is also a buff to Nilfgaard. Using assimilate, you could have a deck that doesn't start with any of the new cards and still end up playing lots of them by the end of most matches. For that reason, the big question for new Nilfgaard cards is, will it be better to use them, or just play all the new cards that your opponent is using with assimilate? Or might the new cards actually further support the assimilate archetype, giving them not only the strength of their opponent's cards, but even more power on top of that? Well, I mean, if so, then that would make Nilfgaard absolutely broken, so fortunately for balance purposes, that's not the case. In fact, it's actually the opposite. Somewhat similarly to Northern Realms, Nilfgaard is getting a completely new archetype, cultists. First, as we see here, we have the Nilfgaard common card, Eternal Eclipse Initiate, a 4-power, 4-provision human cultist. It has an order ability that gives an enemy unit a status which will make it take damage every time you play a cultist. When that unit gets destroyed, it will spawn a 1-power copy of itself on your side of the board, adding the cultist tag. This is similar to Assimilate because you are eventually trying to create copies of your opponent's units, though in this case, that unit is going to be created via a spawn, not a play, so that means that you won't actually trigger Assimilate, and for that reason, this looks like it's more of an alternative to Assimilate rather than a way to support it, and except that rather than creating copies of your opponent's cards and boosting your cards, you'll be creating copies of your opponent's cards and damaging your opponent's cards. It will also help to swarm your side of the board with a high number of weaker units, which is not really something that Nilfgaard has done much of in the past. In fact, it might even mean you want to spawn additional copies of the Eternal Eclipse initiative and focus more on this swarm strategy. Then next, we have the Eternal Eclipse Deacon, which is a 5 power, 5 provision human cultist. When you play it, it gives a status to a card in your hand that gives it the cultist tag, and an order ability that will give a card in your deck the cultist tag. This one's pretty simple. Before the addition of the new cards, the Prophet was the only cultist that Nilfgaard could have in its starting deck. And with the Eternal Eclipse Deacon, now you can make other cards count as cultists. So that can make it so you still have lots of cultist synergies, even if you only have a few starting cultists. The card itself may not be that exciting, but it's all about giving you lots of options with your other cards. Then for the Epic card, we have the Master of Ceremonies, a 7 power, 7 provision human cultist. At the start of the game, it will give a status to 2 of your non-cultist units in your deck to give them the cultist tag. When one of these cards gets played or summoned, if you control at least 3 cultists at the time, you will damage the lowest infused enemy unit by 3. This card is very similar to the Eternal Eclipse Deacon because it also gives you the cultist tag to some of your non-cultist cards, though in this case, it happens automatically at the beginning of the game, so you don't actually need to play the Master Ceremonies to trigger that ability. It also sets up some damage to more easily trigger the death blow on whatever card you infuse using the Eternal Eclipse Deacon, further supporting that swarm strategy. Finally, we have the Nilfgaard legendary card, which is the Eternal Eclipse, a 15 provision scenario that progresses when you play a gold cultist, meaning that an epic or legendary in that case. And at first glance, that looks like the hardest scenario to trigger by a huge margin because the Prophet and Master of Ceremonies would be the only cards able to trigger it. However, because most of the new cultists can give the cultist tag to your non-cultist cards, as long as you get that tag to a few gold cards, it becomes much easier to trigger the scenario. First, it will spawn an Eternal Eclipse Initiate, a low-pace card, but as we said before, if you go all in on supporting it, you could destroy many of your opponent's units and create copies of them on your side of the board, so it's a long-term card and its potential is variable, but could be great. Once you play your first cultist, gold cultist that is, all of your cultists on the board, in your hand, and in your deck will get boosted by 1 when you play a gold cultist, or boosted by 2 when you play a bronze cultist. This is insane. You actually want to play this scenario as early as possible because if you do so in round 1, then you can boost all the cultists in your hand and deck, giving you the potential for lots of carryover for round 2 and round 3. The thing that you'll need to balance though is that because you won't start with many cultists in your deck, by playing the scenario early, you have much more time to boost those cultists, but you don't have many cultists to boost. That means that you may want to at least play an Eternal Eclipse Deacon first to get a few more of those cultists as soon as possible. Speaking of the Deacon, when you play your second gold cultist, that's the card you'll play. Similarly to the other scenarios, assuming that by this point you'll have a large number of cultists, that will be a big point slam, though some of those points may be going to cards in your hand and your deck rather than all of them going directly onto the board. That means potentially better carryover, but probably not as much immediate tempo as some of the other scenarios. Overall, the new cultist archetype for Nilfgaard looks really interesting. We know that Assimilate is incredibly powerful, and if this is, in theory at least, the damage version of Assimilate, then it could be very powerful as well. That being said, as often is the case for Nilfgaard, because those cards are so new and unusual, and lots of diverging lines to consider to play, it will be difficult to play them, at least to play them optimally. Then finally, we have neutrals. And for neutrals, we'll start with the common, Renfri's Gang, which, at 6 power and 6 provisions, is a cursed human bandit. When you play it, if you have at least 25 units in your starting deck, which in almost all cases would mean no specials and no artifacts, then you will summon all copies of this card from your deck. That's potentially 12 points for 6 provisions with 1 thinning in 1 turn, which is amazing. Similar to the popular Nilfgaard Blightmaker plus Mage Assassin combo, though in this case, the big cost is that no special or artifacts in your starting deck is a huge handicap, and means that you cannot use any of the scenarios unless you add an extra 26 card into your deck, which I don't think most people would do, but is theoretically an option. Then we have Eltibald, which is a 6-power, 11 Persian mage with a Zeal order that will infuse an opposing unit with a status that will make it take 1 damage whenever you play a card. That order has a 3-turn cooldown, but the cooldown gets reduced whenever you play a card with the curse tag, so you may be able to set up additional rounds of that fairly quickly. That's the potential for a lot of damage, but at 11 provisions, it's super expensive, so the question here is just, is that going to be worth it? But then last, and certainly not least, we have, finally, Renfri, possibly the single most highly anticipated card in the game ever. And I don't think she'll disappoint. She's a 7-power, 13 provision cost cursed human bandit that, if you have 25 or more units in your starting deck, replaces your leader ability with a much more powerful ability with 2 different components. As we said before, 25 units in your starting deck is a big handicap, but when you see the leader ability buffs that you can get, I think you'll agree that that could be worth it. In all cases, you will probably want to use your starting leader ability early, then once it's been used, replace it when you play Renfri, similar to how you would use Anna Henrietta. First, there is the Blessing component, which you can choose between a variety of passive benefits that usually trigger either on turns when you do or do not use your leader ability. You could boost your lowest unit by 1 if you haven't used your leader ability, set your lowest unit to 12 after using your leader ability, play the lowest provision cost card from your deck when you use your leader ability, split 8 damage randomly to your opponent's units when you use your leader ability, boost units on when you play them, next to odd or even powered units, boost a unit when you pass, or give a cooldown to your new active ability. All of which sound very, very strong. But wait, there's more. Because you also have a new active ability. And in this case, your new active ability, or curse, you can spawn a copy of one of your opponent's units, boost an allied unit by its base power, spawn both your faction stratagem and a neutral stratagem, play a bronze unit, then draw a card, damage all enemy units by 1 or 2, then if they, or 2 if they either were damaged or boosted, damage unit by 7, and then damage adjacent units by the excess power, or destroy an enemy unit by 10, or if it has 10 or less power. Almost endless options, all of which will vary in usefulness depending on the deck you're using, the deck your opponent's using, when you play it in the match, and what is currently happening on the board. But that combination of points and flexibility that it gives you makes it unquestionably the strongest card in the game. But it comes with a catch. Not only is it tough to have a deck with 25 units, it also means that you could build your entire deck around Renfri, but if you never draw her directly, then it would be very difficult to tutor her without any specials or artifacts. Some leader abilities, like Nilfgaard's Tactical Decision, might make that slightly easier, but that's still no guarantee. So that would make Renfri decks a very hit-or-miss type of situation. Did you draw Renfri? Okay, you probably win. You didn't draw Renfri? Okay, well, have fun with no specials, artifacts, or scenarios. Again, that's why we might see people just crazy enough to squeeze in a 26th non-unit card into their deck to help tutor Renfri for more consistency at the cost of needing to free up enough provisions to add that card. Would that be worth it? Renfri is so strong that it might be, making that, in practice, the reason why she isn't going to single-handedly break the game. So overall, I think we've seen some very powerful new cards that look like they will either breathe new life into archetypes that needed a lot of love, or create new archetypes altogether. Which cards which ones do you think will be the strongest, and which ones are you most excited to play? Well, it turns out that there will actually be a new seasonal event this Tuesday that gives us all entirely new decks pre-created by CDPR based on the new cards, the perfect way to try them out. And we do lots of seasonal event deck guides here, so you can see me there. And if you like this video, then make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.